Hey, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. You're listening to the longest running superhero role playing game on Earth. I'm your host, the Game Master. And before I say anything else, I want to wish you guys a happy new year. I record these in advance these days, but this one is due to drop on New Year's Eve. So, first, I wanted to wish you guys a very happy holiday. But then I wanted to thank you guys because it's the last video of the year. And I wanted to thank everybody for sticking with me this year. Um, it's been an awesome year. We did a live stream exactly this time last year, and when we did that, I only had 80 subscribers. And now, as of me recording this, we're over 400. We're close to 425. So, thank you guys so much. The channel blew up. And even when I would do videos, because I'm sort of reporting on what we did for better or worse, right? And even when it's the videos that are not great, you guys are still being supportive. And like that is so amazing to me. So seriously, from the bottom of my heart, thank you for an amazing year. So we're getting ready to do 2025. And the irony is, I couldn't have planned this better if I tried. But the first video of 2025 kicks off the current generation of the game or the next generation, um, where the children, the heroes who have gone before, sort of rise up and take over, and it becomes their story. And we just wrapped up stuff like Blackest Night, and that was the end of everything that came before it, right? But so now we're to the point in our timeline where it's the year 2010. And 2010 is weird because I call it the gap year because there was this gap between what came before and what has yet to transpire. And the world, there are still some heroes. Like we still have our Superman, who's the guy who formerly known as Lord Zod. He survived because he had a lantern ring, and I won't go into it, but there are still some heroes here and there, right? But not enough. And the world feels very unprotected. So in the gap year, we basically did three things. And each one of those things lasted for about 4 months. So the first thing we did was we made original characters that were street level adventurers. And when you make a brand new character in DC Heroes, you give them 450 points to work with, right? So every single one of these characters were 450 point characters. And we did some stuff with them, and that was cool. I had a good time with that, but they weren't at that level where they were like the guardians of the world. You know what I mean? They were just sort of like we did a thing with some robots. We did a thing where it was basically like kind of the story was like Skynet meets 3D printers, right? And so it was these things would get sort of hacked by this artificial intelligence. It would create drones that were going around doing stuff, and the street level guys had to deal with that. The next thing that we did was near and dear to my heart, actually, and it's kind of hard to explain. So I spent a ton of time as a kid in shopping malls. And the reason for that is how do I want to put this? So like my grandma was the nicest person you'd ever want to meet. She was your quintessential sweet little old lady where you'd walk in the door and she would be like, "Have you eaten yet? Let me feed you." Right? Like that was her love language. And she would try to give you, apple pie or sugar cookies or whatever. You get the gist, right? Um, but then my grandpa was the exact opposite. He was grumpy and mean and just downright hateful. He was just evil, dude. And so my mom didn't want to be around him. And so if, she would work Monday through Friday, she would often work doubles where she was coming home very late at night. Um, and she would go straight to her room and kind of lock her door, and I wouldn't see her at all through the week. And then on the weekend, she'd wake me up on Saturday morning before my grandpa had woken up, and we'd leave for the entire day and we'd be at the mall. And she would stay there shopping until the mall closed at 9 o'clock. And then we'd go out to eat someplace that was usually open until 11. And then when they kicked us out, then we'd go home after my grandpa was already in bed, you know. And then Sundays, we did the exact same thing again. So I spent probably, I would assume, way more time in malls than like anybody else. And so when I say I'm nostalgic for shopping malls, I just want you to kind of get where I'm coming from there, right? And it's really weird to see them like going out of business and getting torn down and, stuff like that. My local shopping mall is slowly being assimilated by a hospital chain, and it is becoming a hospital, and that's weird. It's weird for me to think that as an old man, if I have a heart attack or something like that, they're going to rush me to the mall. I mean, that seems like that's where it's going. Um, at any rate, though, so I'm a huge fan of this YouTube channel by Dan Bell, and I think it's just called the Dead Mall series. And he's like an urban explorer. And then sometimes he goes to the ones that have already closed and he explores them and he's walking around looking at them. Sometimes he goes to the ones that haven't closed yet, but they're kind of circling the drain. If you're into that sort of a thing, I would highly recommend it. Like, by all means, go check out Dan Bell's channel. But I am fascinated with this channel for like emotional reasons. And it's hard for me to put into words what's going on in my head. That I see these things that I associate it with my mom and I associate it with my childhood. And like it was so rare for me and mom to do anything together outside of a mall. You know what I mean? That um I want to kind of contextualize it as best as I can. So I was drawing from those feelings when I ran this Murderworld thing. And so the idea is that in Blackest Night, tons of heroes are dead, so on and so forth. So Captain America, who survived, goes to Murderworld. And it's under Coney Island. It's way, 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 way bigger than Coney Island, but there's an entrance in Coney Island. There's this thing kind of like the old Tunnel of Love ride. And so Cap goes in there, and then there's a ladder and like a sort of a hatch thing you open, and you go down the ladder into Murder World. And so when he enters, I based it on the Dead Mall series, where, for instance, water had been dripping down for decades because nobody had been to Murder World since like the real early 80s, basically. Maybe mid 80s at most, but you get the gist, right? So for decades, place was totally abandoned because in our world, Arcade went to prison and never got out, right? So I'll hedge my bets and I'll say since 1990 he had been in prison. And even then, at some point he gets killed in prison. And I couldn't tell you what year that was now off the top of my head without looking, but So he's gone. But Murder World has been dormant this whole time. And when Captain America enters it and he trips the security system, all of a sudden, after all these years, the lights start coming on, and there's like decades worth of cobwebs and so on and so forth. And there's rats and there's spiders. And I don't know if I said this already, there's water leaking because Murder World wasn't just under the land of New York, it was all the way out under the water because there's a comic book where I think it's the Fantastic Four. They come up through a hatch and they're on an island off the coast of New York, suggesting that the Murder World complex is so massive it's spreading out under the Atlantic Ocean. So we said that there was seawater coming down through the ceiling in different parts of Murder World. So some sections of it were flooded and so on and so forth. And there's mold and just all sorts of problems, right? Stuff that had Arcade been around, he would have been dealing with it. So so at any rate, Cap triggers the security system, and the security system activates something called instant androids. And if you're unfamiliar, the X-Men at one point go to Murder World, and Wolverine has to fight the Hulk. And he thinks it's really the real Hulk, right? Which is kind of impressive because that means it even smells like the Hulk. But at any rate, it's like a Terminator, basically. And there's machinery here that can just whip these things up willy-nilly. And Arcade sort of like scanned all of the heroes during the Bronze Age, like in the late 70s, right? So it would be those versions of each character. And those files are still in the computer banks here. The machinery here, all these years later, can still make robots that look like the heroes of our childhood that we are nostalgic for, right? So this is where that's why I mentioned that mall stuff, is can you see how some of those themes are creeping in here? So Cap defeats the androids, fights his way to the center of Murder World where there's a control center where Arcade and what were his henchmen's names? It was like Lock and Barrel or Lock and Stock or something like that. I don't know. But at any rate, it's where you would always see them, in the control center. So Cap gets there and he's brought with him inside of his shield there a modern, a 2010 that is laptop computer, and he has all the stuff on it he needs to shut down the security system and then assume control of Murder World. And the idea we went with was that I'm sure the security system was very state of the art by the standards of like 1985, right? But in 2010, there was enough progress made in the world with technology that it wasn't that hard for a guy like Steve Rogers to take control of the situation. So he does. And then he has those machines make replicas of his friends who have died so that we have like Android Hulk and Android Iron Man and Android Thor, and you know what I mean? And for a little while then they were our Avengers. So we played that. And I liked it personally. Like I'm reminded of there's this Irish word called Avala. I know I mentioned it before, but I feel like it's a big part of my life actually. And it's spelled Abhaile. That's pronounced Avala. And it can mean multiple things. One thing it can mean is that you're homesick for your home that still exists. Like you're on vacation and you just miss your dog or something back at your house. but it can also mean like I'm homesick for the house I grew up in when I was a little kid, right? Where now we're not so much talking about a current location, but then it can also be a longing for a bygone era that you know will never return. And that's the big one for me, man. If I had to pick one word to express what is like almost always my mood, that's the one. And so there was something about this Murder World game that I really loved. And it was this idea of my version of Murder World with the android duplicates of fallen heroes, you know. It's sad. It's like a sad recreation of the good old days. Um, so I liked it. You know, I felt like I was kind of making a statement there. Um, and I even feel like you could argue that the modern comic book industry is kind of like the ghost of the comics of the past that we grew up on, you know? And so like the androids were kind of like a metaphor for that in a way. I just really liked it. You know, I felt like it worked on multiple levels, but it was one of those things where for me it had like tremendous personal meaning, but the way my players were looking at it was more like the androids don't have emotions. You know, like I'm not really playing a character. I'm playing like a machine that's pretending to be that character. And I know, for instance, like my son was a big fan of Red Hulk, and my friend Jay had said that there are all these clones of the Red Hulk called the Barathi. And this is a long story, but the point is, we had the Green Hulk android fight the Red Hulk clone. And like that was one of the android adventures. And the reason I mentioned that one specifically is because there was no story. You know, it was just more about tactics and, you know, I moved my miniature to this section of the map. You know, it was like wargaming, not role playing. And so that's I think why that era didn't last. And then the third thing we did was based on Secret Invasion. And it was honestly the opposite of Secret Invasion. And this would be a really easy thing for me to kind of stumble on. But if you read the Secret Invasion comics, something that they have in there is that the scroll keeps saying, well, let me back up a little bit, explain something. So in the past, traditionally speaking, the scroll were sort of more two-dimensional bad guys. You know what I mean? So we find out that there had been a Skrull civil war, and various people had been struggling with each other to see who was going to run the Skrull Empire. And when the dust settled, there was this female Skrull named Varanki. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I've only ever seen it written on the page. I've never heard it in a movie or anything like that. But at any rate, Varanki becomes the Skrull Empress, and she's religious. And my understanding is before this, the Skrull were not religious. So because of all that, well, let me, this is such a mess. Let me say this too. Um, when she is running the show, some of the Skrull are loyal to her and they will act a certain way, right? But she is still empress over those who had been her political enemies. and she will give them orders. And what we see in the comic is like if she says, I want you to go to Earth and I want you to do this, this, and this, like they'll go to Earth and then, but they're not necessarily doing all the things they were told to do, right? So we use that in our game. But you seem to get a mixture of scrolls with differing mentalities. And I do like that. I think that's realistic because it's not like, if you go to the army or something, it's not like everybody is the same guy. I have a bunch of friends that are in the army and they're all different, you know. So at any rate then, in the comic, what they keep saying is a scroll will tell somebody he loves you. I can't remember if they said he or she now, but I think it was he. But they'll be like, he loves you. And then they would just kind of go to the next scene or whatever. And so finally, at the end of this long story, this big event, I want to say, and mind you, I haven't read this now for ages, like 20 years or something. But I want to say at the end of it, I think they're talking to Nick Fury, and someone says he loves you, and Nick Fury is like, who is he? And the scroll says something along the lines of, well, God, of course. And I'm going to pause that right there for a second. So, like, I've met Bendis in real life. I met him at Mid Ohio Con in Columbus, Ohio in November of 2001. It's a long story. Um, I won't go into it because this video is already going to be pretty long. But so Bendis is very outspoken on the subjects of both politics and religion. Um, I personally kind of try to avoid a lot of that sort of thing myself. He does not. And Bendis, I don't know how to put this delicately. In his mind, you're either with me or you're against me, is his mentality, you know? And so he was trying to make some big uh statement about religion when he in this moment here, where the scrolls are his analogs for Christians, how he perceives Christians to be as a non-Christian. Um, and so what happens next then is Nick Fury has a really weird line about how the Marvel heroes all worship Thor. And like you turn the page and there's this big splash page and Thor's there. And Fury seems to be saying like um the almost like the state religion of the Marvel universe in the way is like Norse Teutonic paganism because Thor's walking around all the time and they see him and interact with him and therefore that's their religion, right? Which I already think that's just such a strange, like the story is so weird on so many levels. And like I'll just throw this one out for a quick example, right? Kamala Khan, Ms. Marvel, right? That's not her religion. Dust from X-Men would not worship Thor, right? Like Nightcrawler, who back then was either a Catholic priest or training to be a Catholic priest, he would not worship Thor, right? So like Nick Fury's thing just doesn't make sense. And I feel like this is a big thing with Bendis, where he doesn't really care what a character's personality even is. he just wants to do what Bendis wants to do. You know what I mean? Um, and so then, and I can't remember if it's immediately after that or this is another scene or what, but I was also really shocked that then we get this thing where the Marvel quote unquote heroes are honestly acting a lot like zombies, where they're tearing the skin off of a Skrull's face until you can see their skull. And I just thought that was in really bad taste. I didn't care for that at all. And again, I feel like I got to kind of be careful how I word this, but uh I go to church, you know. Um I felt like when we talk about like we're always hearing the phrase in our society now about how representation matters, right? Well, if I was going to see myself as anybody in this story, it was going to be the Skrulls. And like for instance, there were just these hurricanes in Florida. I was on vacation in Florida when the hurricanes hit. And thankfully we missed a lot of that stuff. But at our church that my family and I attend, we sent the college age kids of the church down to Florida with uh canned food and you get the idea, right? Medicine, and we'd made these I forget what you call them now, care packages or whatever, but it's like a shoebox with bunch of stuff that's useful in a situation that like they're in, right? So the scrawl in the story seem like they're supposed to be a parody of like the kids at my church, where the scrawl come to Earth and they're talking about like curing disease and stuff like that. So I'm like, oh, so these are like missionaries. And then, and then it ends with getting your face torn off. So I was like, wow, that sucks. Like I'm obviously not super into this story. So I decided to just, like if we're doing the representation thing, then that's how I was going to tell the story. Is I was going to tell it the way I thought it would make sense. And so in our version, first of all, I said Varanki was good. And there's a multiverse. I understand there's, plenty of dimensions where she's not, but in the Earth K dimension, she's good, and like we treated her as lawful good. To use some Dungeons and Dragons terminology. But she believes in some sort of God. It's probably not exactly the Christian God, but she believes in some sort of, you know, creator of the universe. And so when Blackest Night happens and Earth is just trashed, Earth is wrecked from everything that happened in Blackest Night, the Skrulls send like what is basically missionaries. And they are trying to use, higher tech levels to cure diseases and rebuild destroyed buildings and just so on and so forth. Do whatever needs done. Bring foodstuffs to feed the hungry. And, you get the idea. And one of the many things that they saw, like you hear the phrase, see a need, fill a need. They saw the need for heroes. And in Secret Invasion, something they'd done I thought was really cool was enough time has passed now that the Skrulls have figured out the Super Skrull thing where they can just make tons and tons and tons of Super Skrulls. And so we ran a campaign of that, and that one went really, really well, where everybody played a Super Skrull. And since the original Super Skrull had the powers of the four members of the Fantastic Four, I told all my players pick four Marvel characters and then go through their character sheets from the Marvel Superheroes role playing game and cherry pick So whichever one of your four heroes has the highest dexterity, that's your Super Skrull's dexterity. Whichever one has the highest strength, that's your strength. And so we had an all Skrull party, and that was pretty awesome actually. And people got really, really um creative with whose powers they had. And they were looking at the Marvel universe like, well, like who are the big guys? Who do I want to be, and they would start going through, picking stuff. It was awesome. So that was pretty fun. And that was kind of the end of the gap year. And honestly, I hate to say this, we played the scroll thing for a while and we never really said what happened to the scroll. It was one of those things where we played role playing games until we got tired of it. And then we moved on to the kids and we started doing this stuff with Batboy and Superboy and Wonder Girl and stuff like that. That's what came next. And so I guess I have yet to run a game that shows the ultimate fate of the scrolls. I don't know if they I mean, I guess it would make sense that they just stick around on Earth for about a year helping out. And then when they saw people starting to recover on their own, then they would slowly withdraw and, go back to scroll space. It's probably what happened. But I should still probably run a game about that just to make sure. I get people ask me that all the time when they're like, "Why are you running like parts of games years later?" Like this is a great example where we just have kind of a hole in our continuity that, needs plugged. But yeah, that was it for the scroll stuff. Hopefully I didn't ruffle too many feathers talking about religion and politics and stuff like that. Oh, the politics part, I guess I left the politics part out. I think the other thing Bendis was doing was it was right after 9/11. He hated George Bush, which I understand. I don't like George Bush either myself. Um, and in a lot of Bush's speeches, he would mention God. And so I think that is partially where Bendis was coming from too, where he was kind of railing against that, which I get. Like I said, I personally, I don't like the Bush administration either, but I wouldn't use the Marvel universe as my soapbox. You know what I mean? Like at the very least, he was taking characters, like I said, somebody like if you have Nightcrawler and he's on board with like, yeah, I worship Thor, that's my religion, like, nah, that's not Nightcrawler's thing. Like, I'm not Catholic, but I would still have Nightcrawler be Catholic, right? I wouldn't change Nightcrawler to be more like whatever I am. Does that make sense? At any rate. So yeah, that's what we did. I hope that you found this enjoyable. Um Again, happy New Year's. Thank you guys for sticking with us through the year. Um as always, if you want to support our channel, we would love it if you did the thing, right? Smash like, check to make sure you're still subscribed because YouTube loves to unsubscribe you and not tell you. And leave us a comment. I think a great comment for this one would be tell me what you're doing for New Year's. Are you going out with friends? Are you going to have a few drinks at home? Maybe you're old like me and you're just going to bed. Whatever the case is, let me know. Maybe some of you are going to be playing role playing games. I would love to hear about that. But whatever you're doing, tell me about it in the comments section there. And from everybody here at the longest running superhero role playing game on earth, Happy New Year's. And we will see you in the next year. Bye.